What's going on, everyone? So happy Sunday. I got something a little bit different for all of you today. As you can see behind me, I've got some of my old tier lists that I've done for Star Wars Unlimited. I'm going to go through all the different ages. I've got, well, I think like 3 different leader tier lists that we got to talk about in terms of how I rated them during the time. And I'm going to be critiquing, maybe roasting them a little bit from the past. Now, as I said, we have all the different tier lists from the time. So this is like set 1 only, early set 1 leader tier list. We have a little bit later into set 1 leader tier list. We have an early set 2 leader tier list. And then finally, the last tier list that I did, which was a little bit different than a leader tier list, but we're going to be going through all of it and kind of critiquing it. Since a lot of you really enjoy the tier lists, I figured, well, why not go back and see what we really got wrong, or what I really got wrong. Before I do, big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and I have a TCG play link in the description down below. Be sure to use it for all of your Star Wars Unlimited needs. Let's not waste any more time, and let's dive straight into this. Let's move myself all over to the right-hand side, cover my old face up, and boom. Let's talk about the very first leader tier list. Now, for those of you that have been watching the channel for a while, this was my 3rd video on this channel. So this was very early into set 1. I want to say about a week and a half into set 1 was when I posted this video. So this was like brand new, early expectations. Granted, a lot of us, including myself, kind of had an idea on what the meta could potentially be due to small amounts of playtesting beforehand, as there was ability to play the Star Wars Unlimited cards on like Tabletop Simulator. So we had an idea on some of what these cards would be like. Granted, and as I said, there was a very, very small sample size comparatively to all the tournaments that would shortly be played thereafter when set 1 was released, and of course all the paper gameplay, etc., etc. So this is what I kind of came up with at the very early portion of set 1. I'm going to work myself from the bottom to the top to see if there was kind of any upsets. To be honest, there was only, at least in this list, 2 leaders that I would really give a big change to. First one that we got to talk about, though, on the bottom, or the bottom ones, Hera, Cassian, Jyn, IG, Thrawn. Honestly, these guys are still in the same place as I would put today. These really, in the time and even today, are still just leaders that haven't really gotten there. There isn't really a big use out of any of these. A lot of them are related to mechanics that aren't either important or hard to do. Hera doesn't really have any synergies with any Spectre units in particular, besides giving them an aspect penalty reduction, and those cards aren't particularly strong. Cassian drawing extra cards is insane. Jyn giving you some value trades against other units isn't necessarily super important. IG forcing you to go wide is a hard thing to do in Star Wars until we get to set 3, which might change IG. But also being a 5/4 body on flip is kind of weak, as it dies to everything. And then Thrawn having this ability to exhaust units and playing this controlling strategy doesn't have enough ways to catch up if you're going to rely on the exhausting portion. When we dive into B tier, there are a few leaders in here that you could jump up, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I'd say of the leaders in B tier that I really would not change, especially during the time, or even in nowadays lists, Chewbacca, Grand Inquisitor, and Chirrut all definitely are on the B, maybe even closer to C tier. If I were to add a few leaders into this pool, like from set 2, I think Chewbacca would have naturally dropped down into C tier, and Grand Inquisitor would be on the lower side of B tier. And I think these are totally fair. The leaders that have shifted dramatically, and I think this is mainly due to kind of what the meta has shaped up to be, Emperor Palpatine, Han Solo in particular. You could even consider Luke kind of in the top end of B tier, and his placement makes a lot of sense. But Han Solo and Emperor Palpatine, it's a little bit strange to see them so far down the tier list, especially Emperor Palpatine. Now, this is a leader, again, especially with set 1, we had decks like Leia Red, Sabine Green, Boba Yellow, and Boba Green, which were all still here in the meta, with the exception of like Leia Red. There was a lot of aggro decks running around. And there was a lot of difficulty in playing a leader that was going to flip so late into the game without the ability to play like double green. Okay, right now we're seeing double green Palpatine, and that gives you the ability to play command, which is a way to really situate yourself really nicely in the game. There wasn't as many officials to play on turn 1 as there is now, and so that official into turn 2 Emperor's Royal Guard didn't exist as frequently. There's not like phase 3 Dark Trooper from set 2, so there was a lot less tools in double green, and you're oftentimes playing like Palp blue or Palp yellow, and it just felt a little bit weaker. Now, I do think as the meta progressed and there was more controlling options and more value things being played, flipping over a really powerful leader ended up helping you a lot. So I did think he goes up as we continue to talk about the lists. Same with Han Solo, the OG Han here. This one, it just didn't really do a crazy amount for me in the early stages, but I think this is the ones that I got probably the most wrong. And I think the reason for it was the versions of Han Solo that I was seeing so frequently was the Casino Han variant. And while that Casino Han variant was really fun, it was not good against certain decks. What I mean is, your whole goal with the Casino Han was to get to 7 resources, go ahead and play a Ewing Reinforcements, and flip into so many different 7 drops that are extremely powerful. You had Count Dooku's in there, you had Luke Skywalker's in there, you had all these 7 resource plays that are kind of like game swinging as early as like turn 4, which is early, right? And sometimes even turn 3, right? You would go turn 2 resupply, which would give you to 4 resources. Turn 3, you would go 5 resources, resource with Han, flip Han, attack, get another resource with Han, Ewing Reinforcements, and suddenly you have this immensely powerful unit, which was really difficult to deal with, especially without access to Fell the Dragons, Rivals Falls, but it still was able to be dealt with Power of the Dark Sides, with, you know, removing the other portions of your board, or just any deck kind of outracing you by you dirtling out in the early stages of the game potentially. So this was a really weak version of the deck, at least in terms of what it could go up against, especially if you're facing, like, as I said, the control decks with Power of the Dark Sides, with takedowns and the ability to do a little bit of extra damage. Entrenched was another one that you just could not get past realistically, because if they entrenched your Han Solo, boom, suddenly you're down a resource and you got to wait the next turn and another turn to get to your 7 resources. It just felt super weak against those strategies. But Han Green, on the other hand, just straight up playing a value Han Green deck, or as we will come to see, double yellow Han, end up being a lot stronger. And we didn't really get to see double yellow Han from set 1, but I do think it would have performed a lot better. So that one was the one I think I would have pumped up in terms of going into A tier. The leaders in A tier, I think a lot of these make sense. I think there's one critical swap I would make. I think Tarkin probably should have been swapped with Luke. Not that that was the critical swap that I was talking about, but we didn't really get to see Tarkin all that much from set 1. Even though his leader potential was really high, his consistent value of getting experience, we just never really saw him pop off. Of the other decks that we'll talk about, Krennic, Vader, Iden, Sabine, all of these were staples, and even more so just getting even better as we got through the format. The one deck that seems to be a little bit misplaced is Leia at the top of A tier. And this was definitely just a bias I had during the time due to me playing a lot of Leia and being able to beat a ton of Sabine Greens, mainly because I had practiced that matchup a ton. But as soon as I started to play more and more Sabine Green myself and fighting other people that are playing Leia Red, I started to completely understand both sides of the matchup, and why I was winning with Leia Red was mainly due to other people not necessarily understanding the Sabine matchup. But again, that was just a personal bias because I had Leia Red in paper, so I was playing in paper, fighting against weaker decks as well. I had played a lot online against the Sabine Green players. The game was new, and as soon as we started to see more and more players get enveloped into the game, we started to see Sabine Green dominate more and more. And, well, I started to get a ton of losses with Leia Red as people really got to practice with their Sabine decks. And Leia definitely dropped a decent chunk. Now, there was ways you could pull out a win against like Sabine, but the reason why it was the top of A tier here is because the way I viewed it, again, was that I viewed it as a good matchup in Sabine. You were able to out-action her at a lot of points in the early game and just race her. The problem was, because Leia deployed a turn later, you actually were missing oftentimes 3 to 4 to 5 points of damage in order for you to outpace Sabine. And because Sabine just constantly gets in that early damage, it really swapped it into her favor, not to mention the fact that she could ECL something out to get in even more damage. So she would have been near the bottom of A tier, or closer down past Iden, past Vader, maybe even past Krennic here. In this variation is what I would have decided had I had more experience with both sides of the matchup. The other decks, as you'll see later, Sabine Wren, Iden, and Vader were definitely the favorites of set 1 alongside Boba Fett. But I do think Boba Fett has remained to be one of the strongest decks in the format, and you can definitely put him at the #1 deck right now. So the fact that I have this clear distinction between Boba Fett and everyone else, I stand by. I do think Boba Fett was just on a tier of its own. And we didn't even get to see Boba Yellow at this point all that frequently. It was played every once in a while, but it really wasn't formulated and pushed as a deck yet. But we would see an even stronger deck than Boba Green, which is what we were seeing at the point, come to fruition and be the strongest deck in the format. Vader at the moment was Vader Green, not Vader Blue. It was not a control deck. Iden was Iden Green, same with Krennic Green. All these decks were more soft control. Vader was more of a ramp style deck. The decks that would end up being a lot stronger was Vader Blue, the control variant, Iden Double Blue, ended up being a pretty nice control variant, although I always found this Iden Green a little bit stronger. And of course, Sabine Green and Sabine Yellow being some of the best decks in the format. But that's not the only list we got to talk about, guys. As I said, we have a couple lists to flame here. And we're going to dive into the next one, being the second set 1 tier list that I ended up evolving into. And the first thing you'll notice is, well, all the changes I kind of suggested were made, in that Han Solo's bumped up a little bit, Palpatine ended up getting bumped up a little bit, Luke ended up getting bumped up a little bit, Leia ended up getting bumped down a little bit, and then we have the 4 decks in S tier that I was talking about: Vader, Boba Fett, Sabine, and Iden. So everything remains true of the B and C tier below Krennic. But I think that there was one big mistake that I made on this, and I agree because a lot of you left comments saying this. Krennic was way too low placed. And I completely agree with this, because what ended up happening was we were seeing a lot less of Krennic and a lot more of Iden. And Krennic, just because of the nature of Krennic and Iden, how they played very similar styles of decks, Krennic just ended up looking a lot weaker in the games that we were seeing Iden in, especially when we were watching the tournament gameplay. But that does not mean that Krennic himself was on the same tier as some of these. It was just that he was weaker than Iden. In fact, I would wager to say that he probably earned a more top A tier spot comparatively. And I would have swapped around Krennic and Chirrut most definitely. I don't think Chirrut actually earned his A tier spot. This was more of like a fan favorite deck. We didn't really get to see it push in the top 8 spots of tournaments all that much. Han Green ended up performing a lot better. This was, I guess you could say, alongside Krennic, the deck that I should have put higher up on the list. The stats on Han Green were undeniable, especially come later on in set 1. And these should have been way higher on the list. Leia definitely fell off a decent chunk, especially since the beginning of set 1, but was still getting some top 8 spots. So I do think she should have been A tier, but maybe closer to where Chirrut is. And I think Han and Krennic should have been closer to where Leia is, or maybe just behind like Luke Skywalker, because Luke was actually a very powerful contender in set 1. As I said earlier, everything in B and C tier besides Krennic made a lot of sense. We didn't really see any of these decks except for like the random Chewie Green that popped up, being something that was kind of cool but didn't really stay. I think a lot of people were overhyped about it. I know that I consistently said, like, yeah, I don't think Chewy's a very good list, even though everyone was really excited about Chewy Green. I think taking down an entire tournament, it just didn't really make anything happen. You know, it wasn't like a deck like, oh, people are underestimating Chewy. It was like, oh, Chewy really overperformed, which is one of the reasons why, like, when Bossk Blue did really well in that tournament, I was like, let's wait and see how Bossk Blue performs after the fact. And he's been pretty good. He's definitely not like a Boba Yellow, Sabine Green type deck, but he's able to take in some top 8 spots still. And so it's definitely a deck that is worth considering, unlike Chewy here, which didn't really have any continuous options in terms of making top spots. In the S tier here, though, Boba, Vader, Sabine, these were the 3 decks. And at this point, it was Boba Yellow, Vader Blue, and Sabine Green. Those were the decks that you really needed to beat. Vader Blue represented the control style, Sabine Green ended up representing the aggro style, and Boba Yellow ended up representing the more tempo aggro style. And then the 4th deck in S tier was Iden, and that was more of the soft control style. So ironically, at the end of set 1, I think this is a pretty accurate representation of the best decks in the format. And it represented every single style that we really get to see here. We got to see the soft control variants do well, hard control variants do well, the aggro decks do very well, the tempo decks do very well, and heck, even the more mid-range decks in Boba Green were still doing very well. So this was pretty cool to see, and well, I think that I wouldn't change realistically much about where I would place everything. Honestly, you could even put Darth Vader above Boba Fett, and if I were to come back and figure out, okay, what was the best deck in the format, in terms of matchups, Darth Vader Blue had such an amazing matchup against Boba Yellow. You see this even today in control decks versus Boba Yellow. It just does super well. Yes, they have Bodhi. Yes, they have some things to deal with some of the units that are events that you're playing, but they relied oftentimes as one threat a turn, followed up by disruption and the ability to leverage their extra resources. And Darth Vader Blue just kind of knocked him out of the water. So big flame I have for this one. Han Solo and Krennic, what were you thinking? Han Solo definitely closer to the top end of A tier, and so was Krennic. Everything else makes a decent chunk of sense. But then we dive into one of the more recent ones here, in a set 2 tier list here. Popping ourselves over, we've got ourselves the very first set 2 tier list that I went over. And the first thing you'll notice is this is like before we even got the set 2 release. So there are a lot of crazy placements. Now, there are some that kind of ended up showing up later on in the set that were a little bit surprising to all of us. But there are some here that I personally have found to be leaders that I found to be weak in my initial testing, initial kind of opinion. And the first one that screams, or the first one that screams out to me, it's not Bossk, it's Rey. Rey, to me, in the middle of B tier, ended up performing way better than literally everyone in A tier. Like every single deck in A tier, it performed better. And multiple variants as well. I know a lot of people are talking about Rey Blue, which I am not that big of a believer of. I know a couple of other channels have did some Rey Blue videos, and a lot of people are on the hype train of Rey Blue. I'm not quite there, but we do have like Rey Green that has showed up in a tournament, Rey Red that showed up in a tournament, Rey Yellow that showed up in a tournament. It was surprising how many cards in the format were able to be buffed up by Rey at a really nice pace, right? Cartel Turncoat, a 3/4 in space, like a Millennium Falcon, end up being really strong, right, with Rey. You have like Sonari Peacekeeper, which is just a staple. You have like R2, which ends up being a 2/5 on turn 1, which is really obnoxious. It's just that ability just ended up being way more obnoxious than something like Tarkin, which was surprising, right? So that was really nice. Heck, Tarkin even rose up in popularity. And don't worry, I will get to the most recent tier list, not leader tier list, but another tier list that will combine the 2 lists. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But Rey is definitely an A tier list. And as I said, literally every deck, maybe with the exception of like Cad Bane, she's better than. in terms of statistics and where they've placed. Heck, we haven't seen a single Gar Saxon, as far as I can remember, Mandalorian, or Boba Fett in a top 8 placement. I think we've seen 1 or 2 Kylo Rens and I think like 4 or 5 Cad Banes, and yet Rey's got like 7 or 8 placements in the top 8. So that was the one that immediately screamed out to me as way underrated. Another one that really screams out to me as, dang, that did not shape up to where I wanted it to be, was Jabba the Hutt. And putting him right in the middle between Han Solo and Carrot is just a meme, okay? He is not close to that valuable. Now, Jabba kind of reflected to me as the most interesting variant of like this really high to deploy leader that's going to give us a ton of value, right? What turns out to happen is this ability of using your action every turn is a huge downside. And yes, you can get some really nice valuable plays like turn 1 reputable hunter or like turn 2 4/3 shielded. And yes, that can be valuable. The problem with it is that with doing so, you use your action, you try to set up some nice play, your opponent knows it's coming, and you don't get the ramp portion of it, you just get the bounty portion of it, right? So yes, you're able to trigger the cards that say do something when your opponent has a bounty, or get a discount when your opponent has a bounty, but you don't get the actual bounty from that unit. It's really difficult to actually trade with a unit and get the value from it. Because remember, you have to play a unit beforehand, and a unit that actually is able to kill your opponent's unit, then place the bounty, and you probably don't have initiative at this point because you never have initiative with Jabba. Then you have to, after your opponent takes an action, put a bounty, then take another action, attack, then take another action to play your unit. And it's just too many actions with Jabba. He ends up being not like crazy low on the list, but I would definitely put him closer to like the bottom of A tier or the top of B tiers, where I would kind of situate him right now. And I play like Jabba Red. My goodness, is that a lot weaker than Jabba Yellow? You really need to have fast pace and instant value when you drop your units, rather than kind of setting up more actions that are required of you with Jabba. Couple of other things that are a little bit off, at least in the current iteration of the meta: Hondo and Bossk. I do think Bossk is situated more close to like the top end of A tier as well, with Bossk Green and Bossk Blue. The reason why I put Bossk here at the top end of B tier was that I was worried with the set 1 meta that there was going to be way too many control decks. And if you're fighting a control mirror, let's say you're fighting against like double blue Iden or like Vader Blue, I would oftentimes rather have Vader Blue's deck or Iden Blue's deck over Bossk's deck in those matchups, because they're a little bit better situated against control, especially when you're playing against like Afra and she's running the restock plans. But most of those hard control decks are relying more on the cycling of certain things rather than the bounty portion of it, and they end up performing pretty well. Bossk Blue can do well against the hard control decks. It's not like it's super Vader Blue favorite or anything. It depends on how you build your deck. But that's what I was worried that Bossk was going to end up being situated as, was that you didn't have a way to clean the bounties because people were not playing units at all. And that would have been pretty tricky for Bossk to overcome. Bossk Green especially, less so with Bossk Blue, but still with Bossk Blue. I think that even with the lack of control decks, if there was control decks, Bossk Blue still would have been middle to A, top end of A tier. So I just misshot that one based on, again, how the meta shaped up. Hondo, I want to mention it real quick. I think Hondo Blue ended up being really cool. What I realized over the course of set 2 was that if you just play any deck as a control variant, it just becomes better because they don't care as much about their leaders and their actions and all that. They're just removing your units. It's less so a synergy based deck and more just a high value deck. And so any deck that you play as a control variant gets a little bit better. And Hondo kind of reinforces the value of playing control deck by being able to give you so many different options later on in the game. It's more of a soft control deck, whereas Bossk Blue is more of a hard control deck and just outvalues you by having so many different options throughout the entirety of the game through your smuggle pile, which is really nice. Other than that, I mean, you could argue that Afra's a little bit better. She's getting a little bit better because of Bossk Blue, but I don't think I would put her higher than like the bottom of B tier. And you'll note soon that like all these leaders, I don't even have a D tier on this list. So maybe she's just in a spot where it's okay for her to be in. Fennec and Lando would have been further down on my list. The A tier, a lot of these leaders just didn't shape up to be quite as strong as I was hoping. Cad Bane, I still think should be in the A tier, so there isn't really much to speak about there. Gar Saxon, there just wasn't enough ways to synergize your upgrades or play a deck that's like really just getting you value throughout the game. Just a little bit weaker than some of the other aggro options that we have out there, which is a little bit unfortunate. Mandalorian, this was a deck that I was really hoping for, especially if we saw a lot of aggro variants. It just doesn't do a whole lot in terms of fighting against the soft control variants. Anytime you're running up against removal, you just get absolutely destroyed. Mando's value just dropped significantly. I would put him as low as the C tier at this point in my tier list these days. Kylo Ren, this was a really strong leader for a while. I think he's close to the A tier. He just has a really nice aggro curve and just completely rushes you down. There's some variants now that are playing like Kylo Ren Green with Palpatine's Return, and while Palpatine's Return is a nice card, I don't think it's kind of the proper place to be putting it. In terms of, even though you can discard some stuff, the way I've valued Palpatine's Return is just playing it as a value card. Decks like Kira are playing it, and that ends up being a lot stronger to me. And then Boba Fett. So the new Boba Fett, well, this has been a really quiet leader. Not many people have talked about him, and he's kind of just been like slowly drifting off into the lower ends of B tier. This is just a rebel aggro leader. If it was villainy, there might have been something for him, like a villainy aggro deck. Because we don't really have that. Yes, Boba Yellow is an aggro deck. It's more of a tempo deck. That's really the only villainy deck that we see as like a rush down race type deck, right? If this was villainy, this would have been a leader that really could have had some options. The problem is that because you're playing Command and Heroism, you don't get access to ECL, which is a big downside. The second thing is, because you're playing Command Heroism and you want keywords, usually the aggression cards have the most keywords in terms of curve potential. Well, guess what? Who wants to play Command, Aggression, Heroism outside of Sabine? No one, because that is just the best deck. So it really is situated at an awkward spot and really hasn't seen much play at all. In terms of the other two decks that I haven't talked about really all that much as of with this tier list, Han Solo and Kira. So I was 100% convinced that Han Solo was going to be the deck that was, or the leader that was going to be the most powerful leader. And I think I'm 100% correct about that. If I were to say one of my predictions that was extremely strong, and I would not have backed down from it, it would have been the new Han Solo. And it just performed. Now, there were various variations. I was seeing a lot of Han Green. That was what many people were focusing on. I played a little bit of Han Yellow, Han Double Red. All those decks are amazing. The variant that ended up being extremely powerful is Han Blue, and that's the one that people tend to steer towards. But all of it is just really strong and just ends up doing so much work. The leader ability is just so powerful. I know a lot of people, when I first saw this, I was like, this is the best leader from set 2. And people were like, what? You do 2 damage to your units. It's going to be kind of mediocre. It's not even that good. Whew. I'm happy that Han got his respect after a little while. Kira was the other one. I think a lot of people were sleeping on this one. I viewed her as like, I think this has a lot of potential, and I've seen her do some work. It took a little bit, and I think the key portion of it was to figure out how we wanted to go about playing Kira as a deck. And that was how to kind of take advantage of her unique flip effect while also playing a deck that supports kind of what she wants to do. And this Kira Green soft control variant is really where she fits in quite nicely. This is a deck that really took some time to kind of develop into set 2, whereas a lot of these other decks that were kind of we kind of saw very early on in the set 1 or set 2. Let's just say that. I think both Kira and Han are S tier, and I think those are the only 2 leaders that I would put into S tier from set 2 on my overall list. And that's where we're going to finish off the video. We got to dive into the last tier list. Now, I haven't done a leader tier list in a while, which is why I said this last tier list is going to be a little bit different, because we're talking about all the decks. And I think this is a better version of the tier list because you get to see all the decks that are actually being played. And generally speaking, I would put the leaders associated with the lists at the top of the list, or the decks that are associated with leaders at the top of the list. Those are the leaders I would put at the top of the list of the leader tier list for the most part. Maybe dropping them a little bit down if the extra variants aren't as strong, or if a deck has a ton of variants at the top. And if you look here, there's a couple from set 1 that are consistent in the S tier. Boba, Sabine. But we also have Palpatine and Han, OG Han, coming in at the top of the list. And granted, this is mainly from set 2, but it's nice to see, it's interesting to see how set 1 has evolved. I know a lot of people agree with this kind of top portion of the set 1 or the deck tier list. I don't think anyone really disagrees with my S/A tier for the most part. There is maybe one exception that people do try to make, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I think from what I've seen in the comment section, most people just generally agree with this. And I would still put, for the most part, these decks up in S tier. We have Kira and Han, new Han from set 2. So the two leaders that I put in a set in the S tier are actually S tier decks. Jabba, not quite nearly as strong, and you'll note that he is at the top of B tier. As I said earlier, that's kind of where I put the leader now. I was really disappointed with him, and that was the one I got the most wrong, and you can see it reflected here in this most recent tier list, as I said. But the other lists are up there, and I think that, again, most people agree with that kind of evaluation. As we get into A tier is where things start to kind of heat up a little bit. The 3 decks that I think people mentioned the most was Boba Green. Some people were arguing that it's an S tier deck. I could see that one. I wanted to keep the S tier a little bit more exclusive to where I only had a few lists in there, but it's at the top end of A tier. So to me, if you argue that it's an S tier deck, we're kind of in the same boat because I put it at the top of A tier. So like it's basically S tier. The other list that people are 100% convinced on is Bossk Blue. People think it's the best deck in the entire format, and it's not even close. I'm not as convinced. Again, we've only had a couple of weeks of this list. It has still shown up in some top 8s after the fact. So it definitely is a good deck, and I would definitely put it in the A tier at the minimum. I personally, as far as where I evaluated all these decks and how they showed up in tournaments and how they continue to show up in tournaments, and not only that, but also how they perform on playtesting and how I've tested them, I would put Bossk at the top end of A tier, and that's where he's kind of situated right now. Bossk Blue, that is. You could put him higher than like Ray Red. I think is a safe spot. You could kind of swap those around. It's some minor changes, but that's where I would put him. I'm not quite in the S tier camp yet. The other list that I would consider kind of shifting around, and this is not even on the list for Ray, and that is Ray Blue. So Ray Blue was not on the list when I made this tier list. It was a deck that started to pop up, not even in any tournaments, by the way. It was just a deck that I believe KTOD did a deck tech on, and they believe it to be one of the most powerful decks in the entire format. No one else is playing it, realistically, and they ran into some tournaments with it. They're extremely strong players, KTOD, that is, and so them doing well with a deck doesn't really give me any information because they're just good players. After the fact, if we start to see some sort of shift where Ray Blue starts to pop up in the meta, maybe she's an A tier deck. I definitely think I should have put her on the list. But if I were to have rated her, I would have put her below Ray Green in like the top to middle part of B tier is where I would put Ray Blue. And I know some people are definitely on the opposite side of that. I played with Ray Blue. I played against Ray Blue. I am not quite as convinced about Ray Blue as a lot of other people are. But again, it hasn't really shown up in terms of stats for Ray Blue. So if you weren't even to trust my opinion, or let's say you don't even want to trust any content creator's opinion, if you just wanted to look at the stats, Ray Blue just hasn't really showed up yet. I think she's taken, again, with K280 one tournament. And that's not to say that she's a weak deck by any means. It's just that we don't really have a big sample size for her. So it's really hard to figure out where Ray Blue would situate on the meta, because every other one of these lists in A or above tier has shown up in tournaments multiple times. With the exception of, which one was it? I think it was Double Red Sabine. I think Double Red Sabine has not shown up multiple times. So that's just something to consider. As we go down further in the list, what you'll notice is kind of all the decks that I talked about previously are kind of just where they're supposed to be. The ones that might be a little bit shifted, Hondo, that one is a little bit farther up than you would have seen in my previous leader tier list. I think that's the only one. All the other leaders are kind of in a spot where they are kind of expected to be. Some of the set 2 leaders, as I said, that I overrated a little bit, like Mando, Gar Saxon, Kylo, dropped a little bit. But I spoke about that a little bit earlier. That's where the B tier ends up being. Into C tiers, where you'll start to see some of those lists that I did put up as high in the earlier iterations of set 2, like Mandalorian, for example, is down there. I've just not been very impressed with those guys. From set 1, you'll start to see some of the leaders that have fallen off a decent chunk in B and C tier, right? Aiden's down here, which is a little bit unfortunate. Leia is down here. She's dropped a little bit. Luke's down here in the C tier. You still see Thrawn's. Chirrut dropped a decent chunk. You have Grand Inquisitors down in the B and C tier. Chewbacca is almost D tier. So yeah, those leaders really didn't get anything going for them. And then in the D tier are just absolutely atrocious leaders that like have no really bearing in the game right now. We have like Hera down here. We've got Fennec down here. Hunter, Jin, IG, Lando. Like, these are just atrocious leaders. Hondo has 2 variants that I've seen, so which is why I have both of those on the list. But for the most part, as we start doing this list, I think most people would agree. The ones that I mentioned had a little bit of disagreement. Well, I mentioned early on in the video, the big one being Ray Blue. That didn't actually appear on the list. I don't really know if I missed out on any list that was that people wanted to see, except for Ray Blue. And that was mainly because a lot of people saw the video from KTOD and were like, oh, dang, they're right. And it totally makes sense because, as I said, KTOD, they're great players. They make great content. All of them, by the way. And after seeing it, they're like, why isn't Ray Blue on the list? It's because I didn't really see it in any tournament at any point before that. So, well, it didn't really pop up in my mind as a list that we should be putting on the list. So going forward, definitely got to include Ray Blue. And we'll see if she ends up performing a lot in tournaments. I think Bossk Blue has started to perform more and more. So if that continues to be the case and we see a consistency out of Bossk Blue, maybe he'll end up in the S tier. I've played a lot of Bossk Blue. I like the control deck. So that's a list that I continue to revisit. There's a lot of different things that could happen, but I think this is a pretty good representation of set 2's deck tiers and where I would put the leaders for the most part. If you just take like the top deck of that leader and you just put them as where they would be if they were just the leader, I think that you would be pretty okay with that for the most part. So we'll see how set 2 develops. So we're starting to get real deep into spoiler season for set 3. I'm pretty excited about it. Sooner rather than later, I'll be doing set 3 leader tier lists, and I'm sure I'll be making fun of that in 2-3 months or whatever. But hopefully you all enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think about the tier lists and how your process has developed over the course of time. I'll see you all for the next one.